Okay, so here are my first comments and thoughts in a quick YouTube video on the Palsson article that we read earlier this week. So one of the questions that you asked was, what is genomic anthropology and how does Palsson relate it to the notion of the social and the biological? Well, first, I think we should ask, what is genomic? According to Princeton WordNet, a genome, or a genome, is the ordering of genes in a haploid set of chromosomes of a particular organism, or the full DNA sequence of an organism. So it might be said that the human genome contains approximately 3 billion chemical base pairs. Okay, so that's what Princeton's WordNet says. According to Palsson, the combination of the recent progress made through projects such as the Human Genome Initiative and other local and globally spanning human genome mapping initiatives with the field of traditional anthropology calls for radical rethinking in terms of how we approach anthropology today. Palsson largely roots his argument for a genomic anthropology on Rabinov, who in 1996 published a paper in which he expressed how the traditional division between natural and artificial become on the day when humans are able to manipulate the natural. Thus, if it is possible for humans to deliberately influence what we traditionally considered the natural, then we cannot possibly be speaking of a kind of division between natural and artificial, between biological and cultural, between nature and nurture. Rabinov thus devised a new concept, that of biosociality. Very interesting. For anthropology, this is a major leap because our discipline has traditionally been divided into at least 4 subfields, largely based on the assumption that a line could be drawn between the tangible biological side of the human being and the more intangible cultural side. And using the term genomic anthropology, Palsson largely does away with this division and challenges the profession to become more multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary. So, concerning the second question you posed, how does Foucault's notion of the archaeology of knowledge relate to the concept of contingency? Well, Palsson brings in Rabinov because this Californian anthropological giant may be one of the best North American commentators on the French historian Foucault. When Foucault elaborated on methodology in 1969, in his book The Archaeology of Knowledge, he was most concerned with one way of excavating the deeper meaning behind actual historical discourse. Palsson draws on Foucault in this paper because he attempts to show that the current and relatively persistent structure of academic disciplines at Western institutions is just as much the result of historical discourse. If sufficient excavation is done, we may very well be able to deconstruct the circumstances that have led to the formation of academia as we know it today. According to Palsson, and consequently Rabinov, disciplines such as anthropology have grown on divisions that existed in the minds of those involved. With the recent blossoming of new information in traditionally non-anthropological fields, such as the new genetics, it becomes a question of whether anthropology should maintain its divisional structure or whether it should overcome its archaeological rigidity and expand in a more networked and wider spread manner, so across disciplines. When it comes to contingency, or the possible event or outcome of the impact of genetic research on anthropology, Palsson calls for a critical Foucauldian archaeological perspective towards our roots as a discipline, which I think is a very, very good idea. And obviously it's not really his idea, or a new idea for that matter, but he propagates it, and I strongly support that. The third question you raised is for us to relate to the ongoing tension of nature versus culture in this article and throughout this article. I think this point is sufficiently addressed through most of the answers to previous and following questions. But question 4, which is pretty closely related, what role does Palsson see for genomic research regarding Inuit origins and relationships? No, that actually doesn't relate anyways. What role does Palsson see for genomic research regarding Inuit origins and relationships? Well, Palsson points out the ambiguous nature of genomic research among living Inuit in the Canadian and Greenlandic Arctic today. It is ambiguity largely because of the multiple unknown social, psychological, and political repercussions that such a study can produce in a living population. Most of current ethnically related research in the Arctic today is required to have some kind of a collaborative component to it, and it must be fully accepted by Aboriginal communities affected through it before any research is carried out. Genomic research often plays into the dynamics of political sovereignty, which in recent years has largely been based on the assumption of unique genetic distinction. If Inuit living social communities now reveal traces of genetic relation to, say, Scandinavian Norse populations, the assumed unique distinction is compromised. This compromise theoretically plays into issues of land claims, although practically, these are more defined through self-identification as Inuit. So really, today, as far as I understand politically, someone can consider themselves to be Inuit if they feel themselves to be Inuit, rather than whether or not their genetic code would support that. One of the peer responses to Palsson's article pointed out quite keenly the fragility of Palsson's optimism in terms of the outcomes of genomic research among living communities. What would the ethical repercussions be if the results of a study, such as Palsson's, did render disturbing to the claim of Inuit identity and land? And he doesn't really address that in the article. What do you do? Do you abort the study? Do you just retreat back to the ivory tower, or leave the field with no results? I'm not sure. I guess so. The primary role for genomic research, according to Palsson, remains the establishment of historical connections between prehistoric Norse settlers, Tunit or Dorset populations, and modern Tula-descended Inuit. Were any of these three groups ever alive at the same time in the same area? Were any of these three groups in any way connected through trade? Since more recent archaeological evidence seems to point to the possibility of coexistence between Tula and Tunit or Dorset populations for at least 1 century. That's a very interesting thing that he touches on later, especially in the Silk Road analogy. Oh yeah, and here we go. Question 5, explain the use of the Silk Road metaphor. So the term Silk Road, or Silk Roads actually, originates from the historical record we have of extensive trading networks that once connected East, South, and Western Asia with the Mediterranean, connecting as well Northern Africa and the European mainland. Of course, that's common knowledge, I guess, but Palsson uses this analogy to imply the idea of three continents meeting in Arctic North America, namely in the Canadian Central Arctic, that is the Kitikmeot region. Norse settlers who would have come from Greenland, Tunit or Dorset, who had several centuries ago come from Alaska and initially Far East Siberia, but now would have been established in Northern America, and Tula Inuit, who had more recently come from Alaska and initially Far Eastern Siberia as well. So Silk Road is here a good metaphor for a hypothetical intersection between Asia, North America, and Europe for the purpose, presumably, of trade. Palsson's IGHP project seems to have ruled out the intermarriage component of this proposed Silk Road, however.